If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Almitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Welcome back, Equity Warriors. Thanks for tuning in. Today's guest has been on my mind since we met. I have been so looking forward to talking to her again. Her name is Rachel Sato, and she's with the Anti-Defamation League. She's an educator with nearly 10 years of experience as a teacher and assistant principal in sunny San Diego. She joined ADL as an associate director of education in June 2022, so she's still kind of a rookie, but she supports students, teachers, and communities across Southern California in making school a place of inclusivity, respect, and equity. Utilizing her educational background in world religions and her Master of Arts in Teaching, Rachel partners with schools to implement school-wide discussion-based activities, active learning activities where students and staff examine identities, reflect on biased behavior, and learn new ways to challenge bias and bullying in themselves, others, and society. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Berry. The feeling is mutual. I have really been looking forward to this conversation.
Good, and we're going to have one. And I did not realize you were such a rookie. I'm just teasing you. When we met, you seemed to know so much. I was immediately impressed by you and warmed by your spirit, which is why it was like, you have to come on my show. You just have to. I always knew that the Jewish community stood with civil rights leaders back in the 60s in fighting for voting rights, eliminating Jim Crow, anti-segregation in the South. Not only did you stand by us, but your people died with us. And that, I think, is something that we have lost in our history and our knowledge about who the Jewish people are and what the ADL has done in terms of partnership with our community. So I did a little bit of homework, not enough, clearly, which is why you're here as the expert. I did not know, I do now, that you are about a lot more than anti-Semitism, that you support religious freedom. I saw immigrants and refugee groups, LGBTQ plus rights, racial justice, that part I kind of knew, gender equity, and other civil rights issues. So please enlighten and inform us. I want to know all about what the ADL stands for and what it does. And like I said, no idea what you all did. So I know our listeners have no idea either. So what can you tell us?
Yeah, ever since the ADL was established over 100 years ago, our mission has been to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. And we don't, even though it sounds at first like it has two parts, we don't consider it even a two-part mission. It really is one fight altogether, because we know that when one group is unsafe in society, everyone suffers from that. So we're all about coming together, joining together, and fighting for equity and inclusivity and fair treatment of every single person in society. And I work specifically at ADL on the education side. I have some colleagues even in the office with me today who work in totally different arenas. One working in policy, and he's working towards fancy things that I don't fully understand about the court systems and advocating for bills. And I have another colleague who works in community relations and making sure that we have strong foundations in our community to do the work that we do. So the organization is expansive, and I'm really lucky to find my home in the education sector.
Wow. So we, of course, we're talking about schools. What can administrators in schools do to address bias, especially in young children who may not know that what they're doing is wrong?
Yeah, I've heard, you mentioned I haven't been on this job particularly a long time, but even in the last few months, the conversations I've been having with school leaders are changing a little bit. And I'm hearing more and more that they are experiencing a lot of biased action, and particularly biased language from their students, more than leaders who have been doing this job since before I was born. They're experiencing this uptick. So it's becoming even more important to the way I see it is we need to do two things. We need to build capacity of understanding so that students have an understanding of bias, particularly what they're experiencing. So we want to be specific. If students are experiencing race-based discrimination, if there's a use of the N-word on campus, we really want to dig into that specifically. We want to specifically talk about the historical harm that the use of the N-word causes. We want to be specific in addressing why some Black communities have decided that they want to reappropriate and use that word, and some don't. But if you're white, if you're not Black, you never say that word. We want to
Can you say that like 5 more times so that people really hear it? I just did an episode on that not too long ago.
Yeah, I saw that episode, and it's in our bias incident response guide, like, period, no matter what. If you are not within the Black community, you do not use that word. And it's so important we be specific in talking about that with students, because we can say generally like, oh, at this school, we don't use hate speech. We don't use hate language. But if we're not being specific in addressing what students are hearing, the message isn't really getting through. So we want to build their capacity to understand what's going on. Then there's this other bucket of capacity to respond. So we can tell them, like, here's the history of why we should not be using this language. Here's the harm and the impact that using this language has. We equip them with that, but then we want them to be able to say, okay, now that I hear and see this in the world, I know how to respond. So we also teach them strategies and ways to intervene, ways to interrupt that speech, ways to call their peers into conversation when they hear that language, so that they can not be indifferent towards it and they feel like they have the ability to respond.
So sort of along those lines, because that question was, administrators working with children or administrators and children. Yesterday, I saw on a news report that there was a teacher in teaching Tom Sawyer, or Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I don't know if you saw but used it repeatedly in a child's face over and over and over. And of course, another child in the room had the foresight to pull out their cell phone and record the whole thing, which is how it gets on the news. What do you do with that? Yes, in that story, it's used a couple hundred plus times. It was part of the vernacular of the period, and it is important for kids to understand that. But this teacher went overboard. What do you do when it's the educators that are using that language?
I think we have to think about impact over intent. I hear from teachers sometimes, it's a part of the curriculum. I want to be true to the history of the time period. Okay, I hear your intent. What's the impact that's going to have on the students in the classroom? Because the harm you're causing by using that language is so much more profound than this marginal, I want to be true to the time period. We have to think about the benefit of that. Is there truly any benefit to that? I would say no. We really need to think about the impact. I think it's also important, a conversation I have whenever I'm doing professional development with educators, is about our own implicit bias. I always say every single one of us, even when it's your full-time job to combat bias, has bias. We absolutely do. And we need to be aware of that as educators, as people that are interacting with kids. And we need to be able to hear our own bias, examine that in ourselves, so that we can be the leaders in helping children overcome theirs as well.
Yeah, really important. It's one thing when I'm teaching on implicit bias, I say we all have it. It would be abnormal to be a human and not have that, because we have that vicarious learning. We've internalized these messages since the time we were a small child. And so we've been exposed to people. And since everybody has a bias, you've been exposed to a lot of things. It's, what's down there. And then recognizing that you have it, fighting against it, right? The ones that are bad. I always joke that I do have an implicit bias. I've always liked tall men. That's why I'm 5 feet tall. My husband is well over 6 feet. But that's not a bad implicit bias. I don't know where it came from. It's just down there somewhere. Maybe because I was so short, they always said I needed somebody to reach the top shelves of the cabinet. Right. But there's good and then there's bad. And when it does harm to other people, we have to examine. I love what you said, intent versus impact. Right.
And you raise a great point about these positive implicit biases, because some teachers will come sometimes with this notion that's pretty widespread. My Asian student is good at math. So how does that positive, and I'm using air quotes if you cannot see me right now, how does that bias that some teachers may think is positive actually end up impacting a struggling Asian student who's having a hard time in math? Does that bias really serve that student? Absolutely not. So we need to reframe and rethink and really question these biases we have. And that takes a lot of effort. But the great thing about bias is that it's learned, so it can be unlearned.
Yes.
We're not born with that.
Yeah, I did an activity with a group I was with last week, or I do it with most groups in my, sort of basic training. And after discussing bias and stereotypes and learning to identify ourselves in the many ways that we do, but one, becoming comfortable with identifying yourself racially, which is usually okay for people of color, but white people tend not to identify themselves racially. So they had to also list a stereotype that goes along with that identity. And it never fails. Someone who is Asian will always say, and they do this on a human billboard. So they've got this big sign that said, I am, whatever Asian it was, but I'm not good at math. And they talk about the damage that has done throughout their learning experience and being assumed that they would be good at mathematics. It's, we've got a lot more that are negative than positive, but even those so-called positive biases can be harmful, especially to children.
Yeah, all of our workshops, whether they be with community members, teachers, administrators, students, we always start with a conversation around identity because it frames so much of how we interpret the world, how we view and see each other. And one thing we definitely notice is that when we get below that surface level, when we start to really choose these factors that define us as people, a lot of us naturally tend to define ourselves by these marginalized aspects of our identity, where we see white students not picking when we ask them, you need to pick four traits that identify you. A lot of our white students don't select being white as a primary example of their identity, and instead going towards aspects that are more marginalized in society. And I think that speaks to how much that affects the way that the world treats us and the way that we experience everything.
Wow, that's interesting. So administrators, kids, teachers, what about parents? What do parents do if their children witness bias or victimized? Or what if the kids are expressing that the parents are the ones that are perpetrating that bias?
Yeah. At ADO, we have a incident response team. And so we are always encouraging teachers, students, administrators, parents, report. You don't have to go through this alone. We're a partner in this work. And what I think we can offer is I and myself in San Diego am partnered with 171 schools that are doing our program called No Place for Hate, which means I have an existing relationship with those schools, with the administrators, with the team on that site that's really invested in this work of creating an inclusive school climate. So when an incident is reported and it's from one of those No Place for Hate schools, that connection is immediate. Can reach out, start making those connections, start formulating the plan, bring the parent into that conversation. And even when it's not a No Place for Hate school, we're reaching out. We have a team that helps on the investigative side. So they'll give that parent a phone call. Hey, talk me through what happened. Tell me the details. Then that gets relayed to our education team. I have an amazing colleague who works on this process with me, and she'll talk with the school. We come up with a plan. Like, how are you responding? How are you responding specifically to this incident? And how are you building the capacity of your entire community to learn about this incident? Because nothing is isolated. Everything is happening in a much larger context than one incident. So we work through and really partner with the schools in the relationships that we have and in building new ones so that we can be a support for students or parents that are the targets of these incidents. We also get a lot of reports from schools directly that reach out to myself or my colleagues saying, hey, we know you do this work. We had this swastika graffitied on our campus. We see that one a lot. What do we do? How can we use this as an opportunity to become stronger as a community? And so we work through a lot of those conversations together about, like, how do we learn from this? How do we grow and become better from this?
I wish you all had been around, or you probably were around. I just didn't know you were around. When I was teaching my very first year in the classroom, I was at a high school that was majority white. I'm pretty sure I was the only Black teacher on campus. It was a large comprehensive high school. And someone spray painted a swastika in front of my car in my parking spot. One of my students came in and told me that. And it was the beginning of the day. I mean, this was first period when the student came in and shared that with me, and was just, the kid was livid. I mean, it was, I was glad that they were angry. But I just, there's that fear. And unless you are a person of color or a person of the Jewish community, you may not realize what is behind that and the type of fear and trauma that brings. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, and the student said she went to the office first and yelled at them. She didn't want to be late to class. I had this thing about my kids being on time. And so she shared, by the time I got to my car at the end of the day, the custodians had taken care of it and it was gone. But just that, and I know that now, which is sort of thinking about what you said, swastika, but now, what are we, 2023, last year, and maybe slightly before that, we have seen this tremendous increase in anti-Semitic hate. So can you tell us first, define for people who may not understand what it means when we say anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism, and then what the heck is going on?
Yeah, we think of anti-Semitism as bias, harm, and hate that targets the Jewish community. And we know that anti-Semitism and white supremacy are really interconnected and intertwined. Knowing that a lot of times when we're seeing swastikas, it's become this symbol for just hatred, for this idea that there is a superior people, a superior race, and it's just a symbol of fear and hatred. We do talk specifically about when you're seeing these swastikas come up, and we see them, unfortunately, graffitied, painted, carved into places all the time. And we need to talk about what that means and why that's appearing. We need to talk about how that affects and traumatizes and continually traumatizes the Jewish community, because it's a symbol of something so large and so horrific that seeing that blatantly out in front of you is extremely threatening. But it's also a threat to inclusivity. It's a threat to the general community when we're seeing these hate symbols up. It is targeting a specific community, and it's also presenting a threat at large to what I feel like I stand for in my everyday work, and what I hope that the schools I'm working with are standing for as well. So we need to think about how to address it specifically and how to build capacity at large.
So if a general community member, not just a child in school, but kids in school or people in the community, when they see that, is there a place at the ADL that they could go to report it?
There is. If you just Google, it's how I get to it myself. Google ADL incident response. You'll come up with that form. We have a form where you can submit it. It's automatically then logged into our system. And it's actually really helpful when things are officially submitted. And even when things come through email or through just conversation, we ask, please go online and submit it on our system, because we also are the only organization that tracks anti-Semitic incidents nationally. So we're able to count that number, and we're able to say with certainty, we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. And that's important for lobbying. That's important for creating policy that then leads to actual change, because we have the data. So reporting is critical. And that's something I see too when I am looking at school incidents. I see we have a rise in incidents in schools, not just anti-Semitic incidents, but hate incidents of all kind. We were just dealing with a few weeks ago anti-immigrant sentiment, saying, go back to where you came from. And we track those kinds of hate incidences as well. Having a number is really important, because we want to track these trends over time. We want to be able to give accurate information on what's happening. I also like to think too, maybe this is my optimistic side, but I like to think too, when I'm creating relationships with these schools, I'm a little newer on the job, but as I create, I am constantly saying, report, 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 use our system and report. So I like to think too, that some of this uptick in reporting too tells me, like, I'm also doing my job, and that I am creating a relationship where schools feel like they'll get the support when they report. That's a nice little rhyme for myself too.
Well, we're going to do better than just tell people to Google the form. We're going to make sure that we have a link to that form down in the show notes so that people can save that.
Fantastic.
And yeah, we had an incident this January at the airport, my husband and I, where someone told us to go back to where we came from. And it was a person of color from another marginalized group. So sometimes we don't recognize it. Sometimes these messages get into, and the person had such a thick accent that it was kind of difficult to understand what he said. Took me aback for a minute. It's like, you haven't been here that long, but you have this sense that you can say that to us. Just, it's crazy. I don't know, yes, it's all rooted in hate, but these ideas being promoted to the point where people think it's okay, as we say, to say the quiet part out loud. in any event.
And I think that's some of the danger in these incidents rising, because as it rises, it becomes normalized.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to say, we don't accept this. We don't stand for this. And we have to equip people with the skills to be able to have that conversation productively. And sometimes if you're being yelled at an airport, you're not going to come up and let's sit down and really have this discussion around like the harm that causes and the impact and where you learn this in the systemic ways in which this is harming a large group of people. We might not have that formal conversation, but we can have it in other places. And it's still really important to talk about.
Yeah. At that point, I just wanted to make sure that my husband didn't punch him in the face and end up in jail. There's a time and place for everything. That was not the time and place to have a deep conversation. I want to talk about some good stuff because working in this space, I know for me, probably for you, can be exhausting, emotionally draining, psychologically draining. Sometimes I know I can spend a day with a group talking about these issues, and all I want to do at the end of the day is just wrap myself up in a blanket and put on Lifetime television. We need some bright spots sometimes to keep us moving. So I want you to think about what you're excited about in the year to come in this space. What gives you hope?
Our program, where I spend most of my time, is working within a program we call No Place for Hate in schools. And this is meant to be a really systemic, proactive, integrated approach to anti-bias work. And this is something integrated throughout the school year that schools can do. You form this great committee of student leadership that's committed to the work, and it's supposed to be a diverse group that really represents the multitude of varying identities at your school. And then this group comes together and they think about, what is it that our school community really needs to talk about? What are the conversations we need to have? And then they plan activities that address those conversations. And that's the really fun part. When they say, we didn't have an incident surrounding ableism, but we have a really large population of students that have a disability, and we really want to make sure they feel included. And we really want to make sure that we are using inclusive language, that we're using inclusive practices as we are integrating together. And we just want to have some fun and do an activity that makes them feel included. And that's really where we have these wonderful conversations of students, administrators, teachers coming together. What can we do proactively to be no place for hate? To be a place where every single student of every single identity can thrive within the school. And that, luckily for me, is where I spend most of my time in the day. Sometimes when a school does have an incident, we want to integrate that into their No Place for Hate work. We want to make sure that feels really cohesive. But a lot of the time, it's just thinking about, what conversations does your school community need to have, and how can we make those happen? And the impact, we ask student teachers to always reflect after the activities, and getting to have those conversations around impact and getting to hear about how students feel and how they share in conversation and how they really open up to these conversations is what makes it all worth it.
Hey there, Equity Warriors. I want to take a quick moment to share something exciting with you. You know how passionate I am about equity in education, right? Well, I've created a special space, a safe space, where we can dive even deeper into these crucial topics. It's our Patreon channel, and I'd love for you to join me there. Here's why it's so awesome. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to exclusive content that I will not share anywhere else. I'm talking additional insights, workshops like you would get in regular professional learning sessions, resources that can really amplify your impact in education. But it's more than just extra content. By subscribing, you are directly supporting our mission. You're helping to create more valuable discussions and resources that you've come to love. You're part of the change we're making in educational systems. And let me tell you, our Patreon community, it is something special. It's a place where passionate educators and advocates can come together, share ideas, and drive real change. So if you're ready to take your commitment to educational equity to the next level, I'd be thrilled to have you join me. Just head over to patreon.com/3E podcast. That's patreon.com/3E podcast. Remember, your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue this important work. Together, we can create the educational system all our students deserve. Thanks for considering, and now let's get back to the episode. That's great. I like that. No place for hate. We'll
Yeah.
also make sure that we have a link to that, right? So that people can get to that directly. Let's stay on the good stuff for a second.
Yeah.
You're a teacher,
Mhm.
right? So I know, and even what you do, you're meeting kids every single day. We always have these stories that stick with us, as I think, stories that make us smile, right? So share with us a story about a student that sticks with you.
Yeah. We've talked about this a little bit. There's so many, you can't teach for that many years without really like having those students and those stories that stick with you. And there's one that always stuck with me, and I still think about them pretty consistently. I had a student when I was a teacher who identified as non-binary, and that was their choice. They came and told me individually. And it was a great conversation because it was the first non-binary student that I had. And I was like, okay, this is an opportunity for me to like be an ally, show my support. And I think I actually like went a little overboard and made it a little too much about myself at first. Like, okay, I'm going to make sure like I'm using your proper pronouns. We can how do you want to have this discussion with the class? What do you want me to do when someone misgenders you? How can we have that conversation? And they said, Mrs. Sato, I just need you right now. I just need you to know, and that's all I want right now. I was like, okay, we can take this a day at a time. And it was just about showing inclusivity and respect. And I watched that student slowly become more comfortable, starting small with my teacher is going to use my pronouns correctly and feeling that confidence throughout the day. Then it starts to open up and get into, okay, do I want my peers to start using my pronouns? Am I ready to have this conversation with family, with the larger community? And watching that student be able to open up and become more confident in their identity and be able to feel the acceptance of a community that we were slowly creating together is a moment in teaching that I'll never forget. And it was so simple. It was so easy. It was so simple. And you can think like, wow, this is going to be really big. Like, how do I manage all of this? How do I protect you from the whole world? And how do I make sure this is great? And it was like, I just need you to use my pronouns. Like, that's where we're going to start. And I was like, yeah, that's not too much to ask of me. And it was really simple, and it was a really wonderful, we ended up having a great relationship with the family, and it felt like a great thing to be a part of. And I always take that experience with me, doing small things with love, doing small things that have a great impact is so powerful for that individual student.
Yeah. I think no matter like the lesson in that, the one that I get is it doesn't matter who the child is or what they identify as, whether it's a gender equity issue, whether it's race or culture or ethnicity, religion. They just want you to see them as they want to be seen, and for us to sort of get out of our way, right, and recognize and acknowledge them. I always tell teachers that I work with, when we're talking about cultural diversity or linguistic diversity or whatever the diversity is, the three magic words to remember, how do we operate in this, is to recognize, value, and affirm. Recognize them for who they are, how they want to be recognized, value what it is that they bring to school, to the community, and affirm them, that what they are is right for them, and not to let anyone interfere with that. So it's three little words. It's easy. If we just remember that, no matter what the situation is, recognize, value, affirm, then we're okay. We can put ourselves on the right path. I love that story.
Thank you for articulating that so beautifully.
Oh, see, easy. Every once in a while, I come up with a pretty good idea. That was the one, whatever year that was last year, that I'm dragging into this one. What haven't I asked you?
I think we talked about what we no longer want to tolerate.
Yeah.
The word that comes to mind for me when I think of what I'm no longer accepting and tolerating, and that is indifference. One of my favorite things to do with educators and with teachers is an activity we call practicing zero indifference. And it's so important because as a teacher, I remember, I think I read one time, I'm sorry, I don't know the exact article, but teachers make upwards of 1,000 decisions a day.
Wow.
It's astronomical, the amount of choices a teacher makes. And so telling a teacher you cannot be indifferent in the face of bias is really important, because it's prioritizing. sometimes when I had to choose between like, do you want to start your recess 5 minutes earlier? Do you want to start your recess 3 minutes late because we have the speaker? It's like that decision does not have this impact that will have waves afterwards, but challenging and interfering with bias when we see it is something that ripples afterwards. So when I'm working with teachers on how we can not practice indifference, there's 3 things I ask them to avoid. And those 3 things are to ignore when you hear biased language, when you see biased actions, even when they're a joke. And again, I'm using my air quotes here because we see that a lot. Don't ignore it. Do not excuse it. And don't be immobilized by fear or by uncertainty. It can be really scary right now, especially when you're not sure why something shouldn't be said. You just know it shouldn't. It's still important in that moment to say, hey, that's not language we use in this classroom. Even if in that moment you're not getting deeper into that conversation, it tells not only that student that it's not acceptable, it tells the whole class that this is not a community where we use that language or where we do those actions. So there's 3 things to avoid, and then there's 2 things that we do, which is to stop that behavior immediately. We do not let it go on. We don't let the class laugh and kind of become a part of whatever may be going on, and then we educate those involved. And then when we're working on that education piece, there's some factors we have to consider, like how much time do I realistically have to deal with this in the moment? Is there a better time, maybe a more structured or less structured time where I can do this? Do I want to do it as a class or address it with the individual? Do I need to do this in isolation, or is this a pattern, a conversation I need to have on a larger level? But the most important consideration is what is the needs of the target. And that's really the most important factor, is thinking about what that student who ended up the target of that joke or that speech or that action, what do they need to feel like the classroom is a safe space? So, and I'm telling this about teachers, but it's something I'm no longer accepting in myself as well. When I'm out in the world, I don't consider myself on the job at ADL. My friends do like to joke sometimes, like, you just said that, I'm going to call Rachel, like, we're going to have this conversation. But I do consider myself someone engaged in anti-bias work 100% of the time.
Yeah. It's hard to turn it off, right? I mean, it's just there, and you start to notice. I know that as I work with people over time, they'll say, you know what? After the first time we worked together, I started noticing all these things that I ignored before, didn't recognize before. Now I'm having the conversation. Now I'm interrupting it. And once you're in it, you're just there, right? Which is why I think people become equity warriors once they have a little bit of information and they realize just how much there is out there coming at marginalized populations. So I love it. Tell us again, it was 3 and 2, right? What was it?
3 things to avoid are ignoring the issue of bias, excusing it, and becoming immobilized by it.
All right.
2 things to always try to do: stop that behavior immediately and educate those involved.
I love it. We can remember that. And if we have to, we can rewind a little bit and jot them down if you weren't taking notes. The website for the ADL is adl.org, right? Yes. Okay, we've got that one. We're going to get the link to the form, and I had one more question for you. You are not the only person doing this work for the ADL, right?
I am absolutely not.
Okay, so are there people nationwide in regional offices?
Yes, we have regional offices all over the country, and one in Israel as well. And what they do, they have these same branches. So there's an education person wherever you may need in the United States. There are people that work on incident response. There's people that work towards policy and advocacy. We have an amazing unit that works on domestic extremism. So whatever, the ADL is here as a resource wherever you are in the United States. Report, and call us for support.
Okay. And if you can't find them, if you email me, I will put you in contact with them. But adl.org is the place to start. And again, we'll have those links down in the show notes. Rachel, you're amazing. I love talking to you. We're going to put Rachel's contact information in the show notes. Those of you in Southern California, she's your person, right? Yep. Yes. I learned so much. I know the listeners have. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this special episode featuring an everyday equity warrior doing something amazing. So make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel. Down in the show notes, there's a link for that. Turn on notifications so you always know when the episode has posted. And of course, share, spread the word. And to you equity warriors out there, if you or someone you know is an everyday equity warrior doing amazing things, let me know. We have more amazing guests that are coming up, and maybe you or someone you know should be one of them. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and as always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.
That's it for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 value private VIP day with Dr. Berry herself. Be sure to head over to 3epodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Dr. Berry's gift. Then join us on the next episode.